Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. My annual conference is this week, so I'm just thankful I could get this episode out before I head down to Maryland to deal with that. When I say my annual conference, I mean I manage every single detail of this event, from lining up speakers to marketing to setting up the menu for the hotel catering, the whole shebang. I also set up this really nice networking dinner at the end of day one, which is this Tuesday, at one of Jose Andres' wonderful restaurants a few miles from the conference venue. And as part of managing every detail, I also have to get all of the attendees from the hotel over to the restaurant, which is about 5 miles away. At the end of last week, I discovered there are no buses available for rent in the entire region because of an IMF event, International Monetary Fund, or so I hope. So I am currently scrambling to figure out how to move 50 to 60 people 5 miles over to Haleo, Bethesda, and back. You'll find out next week if how I managed to pull it off. But to quote the great John Polito from my favorite movie, Miller's Crossing, running things. Anyway, the show must go on, so let's get rolling with this week's podcast. Now, my guest, Elizabeth Hand, or Liz Hand as I call her, is making her third visit to the show, or fourth if you count a phoner we did to celebrate the publication of one of her Cass Neary novels a couple of years ago. This time around, we get into her brand new novel, Curious Toys, from Mulholland Books. It's out this week, which is what I mean by brand new, October 15th, 2019, for you time travelers out there. And it's an amazing novel. I've hinted about it in the past couple of months with guests whose subject matter kind of overlaps with some of Curious Toys' issues. The book is a thriller set in Chicago's Riverview Amusement Park more than a century ago, 1915 to be exact. The plot is about a serial killer who is preying on girls at the park and maybe at some other parks. The only person who has a clue about it is Pin, the 14-year-old daughter of the park's fortune teller. But she's passing as a boy and can't risk being exposed by talking to the police about the murder. Pin is also a weed courier to the movie studio in Chicago. Again, this is 1915 when cinema was first developing. And through that route manages to meet some interesting characters, all of which would be neat by itself. It sounds like a really neat plot, great setting, etc. But what makes Curious Toys really special is that Liz brings in the real-world figure of outsider artist Henry Darger as Pin's partner in trying to find the murderer. So elevator pitch is basically Henry Darger, detective. If you don't know who Darger is, Liz and I go extensively into his background over the course of the conversation. Darger was this amazing, visionary, disturbed artist who labored on his paintings and writing to create this massive mythology that, as Liz puts it during the conversation, rivals Tolkien's, but essentially dies unknown. It is an absolutely ingenious move to make him a character in Curious Toys, and Liz manages to incorporate him without letting a character with that much that much story to him to overwhelm the tension of the plot and to kind of brush aside Pin's own development and her self-discovery. I'd heard of Darger, but knew zero, really, before reading the novel, so do not feel like you have to be some sort of Darger devotee to enjoy Curious Toys. It's a fantastic piece of writing. The plot will keep you engaged. Pin is an amazing character. Liz does a great job with Darger and with other historical figures and the created ones over the course of the book. Also, Darger's worldview is exceedingly strange, and we go into that also. That said, the psyche of the actual murderer in the novel is far more disturbing, and Liz manages to convey that beautifully and dreadfully, if you know what I mean. Anyway, Curious Toys is a thrill ride of a story, a great piece of historical recreation, and a pretty chilling exploration of aberrant psychology. I love this novel and was awfully happy to sit down with Liz again to talk about how it evolved through the writing and editing process, and also just to catch up with her because when we got around to recording, it was during that period where I was coming out of a horrible spiral, and while I'd recorded 2 other shows that weekend, this was all done last summer, sitting down with Liz was the moment that I really kind of reconnected with a person and just kind of felt like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. This is somebody who gets what I'm doing and why, and is a friend. And that was the moment that really meant the most to me over the course of that conversation and the whole weekend. We were up at a ReaderCon in Massachusetts. Anyway, that's all a side thing. Curious Toys out this week from Mulholland Books. Go get it. And as past guest and the person who tipped me off to this book last spring, Audrey Niffenegger, put it in her blurb, it will be catnip for readers who love Chicago, circuses, cross-dressers, and early cinema. And, it'll also be catnip for people who like other stuff too. But yeah, that's Audrey's take on the book. Now, as caveats go, not a lot. We recorded in a hotel room, so I had to filter out some air conditioning noise. And as I mentioned, we recorded this in July during ReaderCon and held it for now with the release of Curious Toys. Liz screwed up a couple of names of people she was referring to. The author of the Henry Darger study in the Realms of the Unreal is John M. McGregor, and the curator from MoMA is Klaus Biesenbach. They're both listed in the tags for the episode if you go to the show notes. Now here's Liz's bio from the Curious Toys flap copy. There's a more extensive one at her website, elizabethhand.com. Elizabeth Hand is the author of more than 14 cross-genre novels and collections of short fiction. Her work has received the Shirley Jackson Award 3 times, the World Fantasy Award 4 times, the Nebula Award twice, as well as the James M. Tiptree Jr. and Mythopoeic Society Awards. She's a longtime critic and contributor of essays for the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Salon, Boston Review, and the Village Voice, among many others. She divides her time between the Maine coast and North London. Her new book is Curious Toys, published by Mulholland Books. And now, the 2019 Virtual Memories Conversation with Liz Hand. I'm going to start with a paragraph from the book, and then I'll actually ask questions, but it's the one that really jumped out at me with the screenwriter who says he sank into his desk and stared at his typewriter, feeling a frisson of mingled fear, desire, expectation, the emotion he experienced writing or reading a tale of forbidden things, walking after dark along the Manhattan docks or sitting in a dim Bowery saloon where men gathered to meet others with the same furtive thoughts. The world held a secret, many secrets, and he didn't need a notebook to uncover them. To me, that seems like the core of the entire book, captured in a paragraph. But rather than focus directly on that, I want to ask, where did the book start for you? And the Henry Darger, is it Darger or Darger?
Well, I say Darger.
Good.
Many people say Darger, and
Henry Wessels corrected me this morning, so I'm going to go with a hard G.
Yeah, I've heard both, and I think somewhere I saw an interview with a Darger scholar, and she referred to him as Darger, so I thought I'll go with that. I first came across the sort of the idea of the Vivian Girls in 1979. There was a song by Snakefinger, who was a performer, guitarist. He was best known as a kind of an avant-garde guitarist who played with the Residents. But he had solo albums too, and he had a song called The Vivian Girls, which was a kind of a haunting, weird, repetitive song. And I'd seen him live a few times before he died and had the album. And I always thought, what the Vivian Girls? What the heck is the Vivian Girls? And some years after that, I don't know when, I can't remember, probably sometime in the 80s, maybe the late 80s, mid 80s, probably before I left DC, I read somewhere about Henry Darger. There must have been an exhibit of his that was reviewed. And they mentioned the Vivian Girls, these extraordinary paintings by this reclusive janitor that were only discovered after his death, the 15,000-page magnum opus about the Vivian Girls. And I thought, wow, what a weird thing. But it wasn't until sometime in the 90s when I went to the Baltimore, the American Visionary Art Museum, which is a fabulous place in Baltimore, and saw some of his work there, and then later saw some of his work at the American Folk Art Museum in New York. And then about 18 or 19 years ago, read John D. McGregor's magnum opus, which is called In the Realms of the Unreal, which was the first book-length study of and about Darger. I'd read some articles. There's a magazine called Raw Vision that's devoted to quote-unquote outsider visionary self-taught artists. And there were some articles there about Darger. I think that at least one of them was by McGregor. And I had already read a book by John D. McGregor that was published in the 80s called The Discovery of the Art of the Insane, which I'd used as research for an earlier book. So I was familiar with his work. Anyway, his book about Darger was just kind of mind-blowing because it had beautiful reproductions of the paintings, but it had extensive passages from the not just the Vivian Girls in the Realms of the Unreal, but also from Darger's 8,000-word autobiography, which he was also found after his death, and the 5,000-page book that was The Adventures of a Tornado Named Sweetie Pie. And McGregor was able to sort of unearth from Darger's various nonfiction writings a lot of information about his life. So, what we know about it is sort of cobbled together from Darger's books and also from the recollections of his landlords, Nathan and Kyoko Lerner, who were the people who another resident of the building that was owned by Nathan Lerner, which is where Henry Darger lived, at 851 Webster Street in Chicago. After Henry Darger went into a nursing home shortly before his death, and up until then he was known only as this very weird, eccentric man who lived upstairs from the documentary filmmaker and photographer Nathan Lerner. They had, this weird man who'd been living in what was once a boarding house, and they were kind enough to let him remain there when they bought the building. But another resident of the building, Nathan Lerner, asked to help clean out Henry's apartment after Henry went into the care home. And this guy, David, went into the, third floor room, and after getting rid of all this garbage, just like food cans and crap and just junk everywhere, giant balls of twine, incredible, just weird stuff, and masses of old newspapers and pictures clipped from magazines and newspapers, and a lot, many pictures of girls, advertising photographs of children. He came across all of these paintings and all of these volumes of this book, this typescript. And he went downstairs to Nathan Lerner and said, I think you better see this. And because Lerner was himself an artist, a photographer, and this other man was also an artisan, they recognized what was there. And Kyoko, Nathan's wife, did as well. So what would have probably been just tossed into the garbage ended up being saved by people who recognized what it was. And Darger was about 80, it was shortly before his 81st birthday, I believe. And Nathan Lerner went to see him in the nursing home, the Catholic nursing home, which was the same Catholic nursing home where Henry Darger's father had died. It was really for poor people. And Nathan Lerner went to see Darger and said, "Henry, we found your work. You know, everyone is going to know you're actually a very great artist." And Henry Darger said, "It's too late." And those were the last words anybody ever heard him say. And he died shortly afterwards. So very, very sad story in many ways, except that we have the legacy of this remarkable work. So anyway, I just thought, I've had this long-term fascination with visionary artists, sometimes called outsider artists, and I've written about them before in other books and stories. But Henry Darger has always been this figure that, I was like, God, one of these days I would love to write about him, but I have no idea how. And about 8 or 9 years ago, my mother, whom I had turned on to Henry Darger, and she knew his work. She'd visited the Folk Art Museum and seen it in New York City and would always read about him. If she read about him, she'd, send me the link and say, "There's another article about Henry." And one day when I was visiting my folks in New York, and I don't remember how the conversation came around to it, and she said, you should write a novel in which Henry is a detective. And I thought, what a great idea. Because Henry Darger, he thought that he was himself a kind of detective. He had in his books, he wrote about this thing called the Gemini Child Protective Agency or Society, which was out to look for, missing children, abducted children, and to save them or to prevent them from being abducted. So in his mind, he was kind of imagining himself as this sort of a person. So I thought, that's a really good idea. Thank you, Mom. And
you're not getting a piece of the royalties.
And I filed it away in my head. Well, the book is dedicated to her.
Yeah.
I filed it away in my head and, kind of thought about it for a few years. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, began really doing deep research into that time period and Henry Darger's world in Chicago in 1915. So this was kind of it's something that's been simmering for a long time. And then I wrote the very first draft of what eventually became Curious Toys. I think it was about 4 years ago, and it went through extensive revisions since then. And the character of Pin crept in because I realized that I couldn't just focus a book on Henry.
I was wondering about that because while he's a significant figure in the book, it's really more about Pin.
Yes, exactly.
And I wondered if ultimately the limitations of somebody who is that disconnected from reality in parts became a limitation when you were trying to write about him.
Yeah, exactly. It was a limitation, but it was also, I felt, I didn't quite have the hubris to really think that I could get into his head. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know who could. And while there are some chapters from his point of view, and he is a significant character in the story, I realized that I really would need somebody else to be the central protagonist. And so, and plus, all great detectives, they have a sidekick. So I came up with the character of Pin, who is this 14-year-old girl passing as a boy, who today would almost certainly identify as being genderqueer, and non-binary. But she's a young teenager at a time when the word teenager was not even, used. You could be teen-aged, but the whole concept of a teenager did not exist. And it was a very perilous world for girls, for young girls and for women as well. And for, many people, for Black people, for queer people, for immigrants, in many ways, there are quite a few parallels with our world. Many things have improved, but there were a lot of sort of flashpoints that I felt kind of meshed with issues that are being dealt with now. So I had Pin on this sort of voyage of kind of a heart of darkness where she just, she has this freedom that she enjoys as a boy. Everybody thinks she's a boy, but she's constantly aware of the fact of the danger she would be in if she was a girl, if she was actually, passing as what she was born as a female. So she's sort of, involved in the seedy underworld of Chicago at the time. She's living very poor, and she's living with her mother in Riverview Amusement Park, which was a real place. Which was a real place that Henry Darger spent a lot of time, along with many other people, some of them historical figures. So that was like the fun part, was just having this, coming up with this character and just sort of letting her loose in this really fascinating, very different world from ours, but one that I, could kind of get hooks into.
And what was the toughest part of researching, not Darger, but the Chicago of that era for you?
Well,
and particularly the amusement park world of it.
Yeah, well, the amusement park aspect of it was actually the fun part and not that difficult, because I love amusement parks. I don't go to them now. I haven't gone to one in, decades. But as a kid, growing up around New York, there was, Playland, which people recognize from the movie Big. It's the amusement park. It's a beautiful amusement park, kind of Art Deco amusement park that opened in the 1930s. So that was near where we lived, and I often went there. There was Palisades Amusement Park, which was on the other side of the Hudson. It was directly across from where my grandparents lived, so I could look out and see, the roller coaster and everything, and the fireworks when they had fireworks. And I went there several times as well. And those were in the days when that amusement park, had freak shows and stuff like that. And then as a young adult and into my 20s, when I lived in D.C., I would go, there would be circuses and things like that, carnivals that would come through that, similarly had, quote unquote freak shows and people doing all kinds of odd things and, the weird things in bottles. So I was really fascinated with all that stuff.
Yeah.
But Chicago itself, I have to say, I had no interest in Chicago.
I was wondering if it was an area you had a affinity for.
And which was unusual, because usually when I'm writing a novel, I start with a place that I want to write about, and then everything else kind of comes after that. And with this, it was the other way. I had like characters, and I knew I wanted a crime. But the place, it was going to have to be Chicago. And I have, one of my brothers and one of my sisters lives in Chicago. I have family in Chicago, cousins, my aunt, and, friends there, and I've been there. I never felt particularly fascinated by it. I know a lot of people are, and I know all the wonderful things about it with music and jazz and architecture and everything else. Second city. But I guess because I'm a New York East Coast snob. And I was also not interested in the period, 1915. I have a longstanding interest in sort of earlier, Elizabethan period or Edwardian or Victorian, mid-century, mid-19th century France. Later, 1920s, 30s, 40s, all of that. But like 1915, what's known as the Progressive Era, no interest whatsoever. But so I was really starting with a blank slate. But as I started to research it, I became completely sucked in. It was a very fascinating time. And it was a time when, the suffragette movement, women's rights, the era of the Great Migration of African Americans to the northern part of the United States. There were queer people were not, they were not being able to be openly gay, but at least they were, there were places that they could gather, and there were all kinds of progressive liberal politics and things that were emerging. So that was really fascinating to research and learn about. And a lot of that was taking place in Chicago. That was kind of a nexus for a lot of those things. So, so it was a lot of fun, but it was also a lot of work, because I was starting at zero and having to try to, ramp up to close to 100 in terms of what I knew about it. And I know there's still huge gaps. And I was very fortunate in having beta readers who helped me a lot, who are much more knowledgeable than I am about Chicago. And so they read it and they filled in the gaps in my knowledge and corrected me when I got things wrong. A writer named Stephen Silver, who I don't really know personally, but who lives in Chicago, and he has immense knowledge of Chicago's history, and he offered to be a beta reader. I put an APB out on social media, and he popped right up and said, well, I'll read it. And I was like, wow, thank you. And he did this incredible, job of just mapping this, came up with a map of the city at the time of all the places that Penn and Henry were, because I'd been trying to find maps and I couldn't find them. Well, he had all of this material. He had these books and things, so he was able to do all that. And he pointed me to, people who knew about Riverview. So he was really a great resource. But there were books about Riverview Amusement Park, books about other amusement parks at the time. That era, the Coney Island, Wonderland in Revere Beach, Massachusetts, Luna Park and Dreamland at Coney Island and Riverview, they were all very similar in the rides they had and what they looked like. So researching one amusement park, there was information I could extrapolate and use for Riverview. Yeah,
I mean, it's sort of neat that things that, well, by definition are ephemeral pleasures, nonetheless, you have to find some historical record for and try and build them somewhat accurately in a case like this. So, did you read much of Henry Darger's work over the years?
I read as much as I could find. There's not the 15,000-page Vivian Girls, in the Realms of the Unreal. That, I believe, is still being transcribed. It's owned.
I was wondering. I had no idea if it had actually.
Yeah, I believe that, and the American Folk Art Museum in New York has. I think the largest archive of Darger stuff that was donated by Nathan and Kyoko Lerner. And Nathan died some years ago, but Kyoko is still alive. And many of that, a lot of that material used to be in Manhattan, when the museum was originally located right next to MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. But not that many years ago, they got pushed out and had to move to a much smaller location by Lincoln Center. And it's a beautiful little kind of jewel box of a museum, but it's very small. And they have, over the years, had exhibits of Darger's work, or in which his work has been displayed. But when I was there most recently, it was not on display. And, asking the people, the docents who were there, I believe it's all in storage in Queens, where they have this, I think it's called the Self-Taught Genius Gallery, which I believe is more like a warehouse space. So I guess somebody out there, it's sort of like, the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I was just about to say that.
Or the end of Citizen Kane. There's like a huge, because there was a lot of stuff. I don't know if you've seen the photographs.
No.
There's photos online of his room when they found it. And based on that, the Intuit Gallery in Chicago, which is where there was the first exhibition of Henry's work in 1977. The Intuit Gallery has what they call Henry Darger's room, where they have recreated his room, a much cleaner looking version than the one. So you can look at photos and see what it looked like. But so there was a lot of stuff. And but anyway, it has been published and excerpted in books by in John D. McGregor's book, Michael Bonesteel, who's a Chicago historian and scholar of Darger's work, and he has written, I think, at least one, I think it's several books about Darger. Klaus Eisenbach, I'm not sure if I've got his name right, who was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, who was one of the first sort of insider adopters of an outside art figure. He had bought some of Darger's work early on and got it into the collection at MoMA. I believe donated some of his work, and he's written a very interesting big book about that called about Darger's work called "Disasters of War," because a lot of Darger's work has imagery, military imagery. The In the Realms of the Unreal is about this great cosmic war between, the child slave rebellion against these horrible men who are enslaving children. So that's another resource. So there's, there are, and not a huge number, but there's a substantial number of books in which bits and pieces of In the Realms of the Unreal or his autobiography have been excerpted. So you can read a lot of it. To be honest, it's not all that interesting.
That's what I was wondering. How much of it was the concept of Henry Darger versus the practice of Henry Darger?
Yes, exactly.
In theory, it's amazing, but...
Yeah, I think a little goes a long way. You kind of get it. And
that's the same thing with the character. The way you deploy the character in the book, you could have, again, gone into overkill mode. With it. Instead, you bring him in, you pull him out, you know...
He was, there was no doubt about it that he was a very strange man. Yeah. He was... the people who knew him at Webster Street, they said he looked like a homeless man. He was always wearing the same clothes. He was briefly in the army during World War II. He was never deployed anywhere. He was, I guess, in basic training, I think in North Carolina for, I think, just a few months before somebody was like, this is not a good idea. And he was sent back to Chicago, but he had a military overcoat. And he wore it all the time. He just wore it constantly. And people would see him on the streets, going through trash bins and bringing the trash. And in his, these sort of journal entries, when he would write things, he would bring in string and he would say, another day, more trouble with twine. Because he had these massive balls of string. And, he was... I think it was John McGregor who said, he was engaged in this huge argument with God. He was this devout Catholic who would go to Mass every day and sometimes as often as 5 times a day. But in 1911, there was a young 5-year-old girl named Elsie Parabek who was from the Czech community in Chicago. She was abducted. And there was a huge manhunt. It was, front page news for 4 or 5 weeks. And everybody was looking for her. During this Easter vacation, the children who were on vacation from school engaged in the manhunt to try to find Elsie. And she was eventually found early in May, and she was dead. She was found in a drainage ditch, and she'd been sexually assaulted and murdered. Henry Darger became fascinated with that crime and with her, and we know about this because he writes about he had a newspaper clipping photograph of Elsie Parabek. You can find an image of it online, and it was the photo that ran with the articles about her, and he carried it around with him, and one day it disappeared. He didn't know what happened to it. He lived at the time at Workingman's House, which was kind of an annex to the, I think it's St. Joseph's Hospital, the Hospital of St. Vincent's. Anyway, big Catholic hospital. And this was the annex where he lived, and he had a roommate. And he thought his roommate had stolen it. And he also, his 200 or 300 page manuscript that he had written also disappeared. So, maybe the roommate read it and was disturbed by it. So anyway, after the photograph, the clipping of Elsie Parabek disappeared, Henry Darger just completely... He went berserk. He wrote about, I was cursing God. It was like almost like a triggered a psychotic break. And John D. McGregor has kind of, controversially speculated, did perhaps Henry have something to do with the killing? Because Henry was, institutionalized for many years as a child. He was put into the home for feeble-minded children. He was orphaned at a young age. He was no doubt himself severely traumatized and probably sexually abused and physically abused, and also witnessed it. So we don't know whether he fixated on Elsie because she was this symbol of terrible things he'd witnessed. Some people have speculated that perhaps he had killed her. Henry's mother died when he was 4 years old, giving birth to his sister. His sister was given up for adoption, and he never knew her, never knew what happened to her. So he also seems to have been haunted by that. So that these visions of young girls who are imperiled, and in the case of the Vivian Girls, who are actually tortured and murdered over and over again by the evil generals, but then miraculously come back to life. This is something that was sort of kind of blossomed, this dark flower that took root and blossomed after Elsie Parabek's image disappeared, the clipping. And after that, he began writing about a figure who was inspired by Elsie, who was named Annie Arenberg. And she was very crucial, kind of a leader with the Vivian Girls. So he transformed Elsie into Annie. So he I forget what the question was. There's so many trails to follow.
Oh, that's
so you can
you start falling into Henry mind.
Yeah,
at that
exactly.
Point. Yeah. Were there any? I hesitate to take this. Well, you know me enough that you're not going to take it badly. Any warning aspects to his behavior where you started to think, geez, I've been piling up a lot of twine, or anything like that in your own
that
life?
I did?
Yeah.
No.
Did you ever look at it? Oh, I really should correct myself before I start going down that rabbit hole.
No, I did not. I think because it was so much, because the book did demand so much research and having to just kind of try to achieve the authenticity of the period, in the voice, the voices, the dialogue, the slang. Trying to avoid anachronisms. It was sort of a really intense juggling act to get all of this. And then to also be portraying a character who is a young girl who does not have models for the gender identification that she has, that she doesn't have any models for that. And so trying to be inside her head and make it the head of somebody in 1915 and not somebody today. I mean, girls at that time, and boys too, could, in many ways, could be quite innocent. I did a lot of research into that, reading sociological studies of the time and, things about the onset of menstruation in young girls. It tended to be later. So they were not becoming, they might be becoming sexually active, or they might have been sexually abused when they were much younger, but a lot of them were not entering puberty until they were maybe 13 or 14 years old. And also the fact that many of them were impoverished and from immigrant communities may have contributed to that as well. This was also a period in which women first started to work in a lot of places. So Pin's mother, who's an immigrant, has a job and she's working. She's self-supporting. She has no husband or partner. So I think juggling all of that stuff and kind of keep track of all those balls didn't give me enough time to kind of go down the crazy place. I think I've done that with some other books, but with this one, I didn't do that.
Yeah, how about that opening passage I'd read from the screenwriter's chapter where that need to capture the transgressive and what does and doesn't need to be captured in a notebook. Where does that really begin for you? And I know it's a subject we've sort of harped on in or talked about in the past conversations, but.
Well, there's one of the lines that you read in that passage, something about there is a mystery in the world. Mm-hmm. I forget exactly what it was. The world held a secret, many secrets, and you didn't need a notebook to uncover them. Yeah, and that's something that I think turns up a lot in my work, the sense that there is the world holds a mystery, that there is a numinous quality. There's, there is kind of a transcendence there that a lot of my characters are struggling to find. And many of them, as with Henry in this book, are themselves artists. And I've written about historical figures. I've written about Arthur Rimbaud. I have a novel about him. I have a novel about the Victorian painter Richard Dadd. People who were visionary artists of one sort or another. And this sense of the numinous, which they try to achieve through their work, or do achieve through their work. And I felt that very much with Henry Darger's work, that there is this kind of transcendence that he was obviously trying to achieve. He created a world that is as intricate and strange as Tolkien's Middle-earth. And he and Tolkien were exact contemporaries. And I wrote about this 18 or 19 years ago. I was reviewing McGregor's book about Darger at the same time that I was reviewing a book about Tolkien by Tom Shippey. And I was like struck by, I thought, wait a minute. And I looked and I was like, they were born within a few months of each other. They died within a few months of each other. They were both devout Catholics. They were both orphaned at an earlier age. They both grew up, under Catholic tutelage. One of the main differences was obviously, Tolkien was educated. He had a loving family. When he was taken, he and his brother were taken in by Jesuits who took care of him, and Henry went into Catholic orphanage and then an asylum for feeble-minded children, and where he was abused and never really got above a third-grade formal education. But they were both people who were obsessive about creating these worlds. And there are a lot of similarities between the worlds. They have these cosmic battles between good and evil. They have this Catholic template of belief that they built on. And their artwork, if you look at some of Tolkien's artwork, some of it is not dissimilar from Henry Darger's artwork, more like the landscapes. So there was also this very strange similarity between the two of them. But
so if only he made a Chicago visit, you could have done a buddy
right.
detective.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right, exactly.
Sequel, always a possibility.
Right, yeah. He's a crazy outsider artist. He's an Oxford Don.
You see?
They solve crimes.
Pitch it to Netflix. This is going to be great. Jeez.
Yeah. But anyway, so that search for the mystery in the world and the transcendent, which for me, I think, some people find it, I think we've talked about this before, some people find it through, religion or spiritual beliefs or paths, and some people find it through drugs, and people.
It's that question: transgression versus transcendence.
Yes.
And the murderer in this is also creating art of a sort.
Yeah, and I think transgressive art can be pushing the limits to really see what is transcendent. Transcendence is not something that's easy to achieve, and neither is true transgression. Henry Darger, I don't think, was really aware that he was transgressive. I mean, he was not creating his art to be seen. He wasn't Kathy Acker, who was creating a body of work that was going out into the world where people were, interacting with her and her work. But I think that the transgressiveness of his work, which is there and very evident if you look at it, it's much less accessible than Tolkien's. I think if you examine that, it is very clear that it is a striving towards a sort of transcendence. And he just, he had obviously a very tangled, complicated psyche. A lot of the images of the Vivian Girls and their world are very beautiful, and those are the ones you tend to see reproduced on posters or postcards and online. The girls with butterfly wings and the Blengans, these beautiful dragons, and even he drew naked children, prepubescent children, who were girls but had penises, but there's not really anything salacious about those images. They really do have this kind of innocence, because I think in part because they're so strange. Other people may view them differently, but I think for Darger, they were just, people speculate with him. Everything is speculation for the most part, that maybe he had never seen a naked woman or naked girl, so he didn't know what they looked like. He thought they looked like boys. But so we see those images with, lots of gigantic flowers and things. But then those are juxtaposed with these very violent, very disturbing images of the Vivian Girls, the girls being tortured and disemboweled and eviscerated and strangled. I mean, very, horrific. Something you really would want to issue a trigger warning, because, some of the images that I saw, they're very disturbing. And it's the kind of thing that you think, I really wish I hadn't seen that. So, and those are the works that I think are the most transgressive, because they are the most disturbing. They are, they're involving the torture and killing of children over and over and over again, by these men, by these shadowy generals in their purple uniforms. But I think that ultimately these two things, that the beautiful imagery and the horrific, do kind of dovetail and combine to, into something that was an attempt to access the transcendent, the numinous.
Do you feel you exercised your Darger?
Oh, yeah, got him out of my system?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I did. I'm still very interested in him and interested in talking about him, and obviously any new information about him that comes out I would love to read. But yeah, I can't see returning to him again. I feel like I I don't know whether, no book ever comes out the way that it is in your head. It's absolutely perfect. And that's certainly not the case with this. It's not absolutely perfect. But I do felt like I did set out what I wanted to do, which was try to present this person in a way that would be accessible, and having, Pin there as a hook, as a more empathetic character, a more quote unquote normalized character, even though in her time and space she would, she did not feel like she was normal and fit in. But for contemporary readers, I think she's more of a way into his story. So I do feel like, I hope I achieved that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I enjoyed the heck out of it. But
well, thank you.
Did you feel like you were also getting a break from Cass Neary and that world?
Yeah, I had, it was.
And you feel like you needed a break from?
Well, that was kind of odd because I changed publishers. I took the fourth. I had completed the fourth Cass book and changed publishers and went to Mulholland Books, which is the publisher of Curious Toys. Work with two wonderful editors there, and the editor who I worked with and sold the book to, I knew he was interested in the Cass books, and so I thought, all right, he'll take this book and publish the fourth Cass novel, which was done. I knew I have to edit it, but what he did, he had read the first draft of what became Curious Toys, which was a very rough, very bad draft. But he had read it several years earlier and was not interested in publishing it. But we had this, he said, he told my agent, I'd like to talk to her about this book. I'm really interested in it. And so we had this long conversation for about 90 minutes. We'd not met at the time. And he said, this is a really interesting book, but there are a lot of things that you did wrong, that I think, plot and this, that, and the other. And I said, well, can you give me suggestions as to how
you didn't storm out or anything?
How to make it? But no, I was like, I love working with a good editor. Yeah, I want to be a better writer. So, anybody who can tell me how to improve my work, that's fabulous. So he gave me, all of these suggestions. And he said, if you ever rewrite this book, I'd love to take a look at it again. I can't promise that I'll be able to make an offer, but I would like to see it. And I said, okay, fine. And at that point, I was like, I never want to see this book or think about it again. So I set it, I set it aside. But then a few years later, when we're, getting this deal for the fourth Cass book, he said, well, actually, I want a 2-book deal. I want this and I want the Henry Darger book. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, and I want to publish the Henry Darger book first. And I said, really? So he said, yeah, and I'm going to work with you. And so he and Josh and Emily, the two editors, they did this amazing job of editing the book and working with me very closely to plot it out. And they came up with spreadsheets as to breaking the book down, how to, all of this stuff that was just incredibly useful and helpful in navigating a, pretty complicated story. In some ways. And, I will admit plotting and structure is not my strong suit. I know what I do well.
This one's very, very intricate, but works.
Well, that's because of their, that is their influence.
I'll get them on the show sometime too. Okay.
I'm sorry?
I'll get them on the show sometime too.
Yeah. So that was, that was hugely helpful for me to do that. But anyway, so the Cass book, which is completed, titled The Book of Lamps and Banners, that's been kind of waiting to be edited. And I'm going to be doing that maybe really soon, next week. It's supposed to be July, August. Like many novels, it was overtaken by events. The version I completed was in 2016 and, everything fell apart. And because it's a book that the Cass novel deals with the rise of white supremacists in the UK and also in Sweden, and at the time that was sort of just very tiny emergent thing, little brush fires, and I sort of assumed they would all be stamped out, and instead the opposite has happened. The brush fires have kind of become a conflagration. So, and also Brexit happened, which hadn't happened at that time. So I've definitely got to go back and change elements of the book to reflect that, because it's set in the current day.
A fantasy world, ultimately.
Yeah, right. But I think, a lot of writers got caught by that a lot. It tripped up a lot of people.
I heard William Gibson
Bill
was talking.
Gibson.
Yeah,
yes,
that
exactly.
he completely changed his next one. I was telling Clute I have a trade show in Frankfurt in November and was thinking of stopping over in the UK like I usually do after this one European show, and then realized it's a week after the hard deadline for Brexit. I am not traveling through airports and passport control and everything else with that level of uncertainty. I'm like, you know what? Maybe I'll just see some people in Berlin, record there, and
you don't know what's going to happen.
And that's why I'm not booking something that turns into 6 hours wait at the airport. And
I was there earlier this year for a couple of months, and I left on the 27th, and at that time the deadline was March 29th. So I said the same thing. I was like, I'm getting the hell out of here before this. And I left on the 27th. And then, of course, they were like, oh, well, we'll push it back. So,
Could happen again. But
I know. But I'm with you. I would do the same thing.
If they decide that every EU resident needs to go through full passport control, that's, 6 hours.
You'll be there.
I'll be there until I have time to leave. So,
for days.
So, that's what? I'll pass until things settle down a little bit. John will still be there, presumably.
Yeah.
So, I did want to mention also, there's an upcoming show. It'll come out before this episode does. But I'm recording with Dawn Raffel, who did a book about Dr. Cooney, the guy who invented the incubators.
Oh, how cool is that?
Yeah, which you mentioned in the amusement park section early on with the book. I'm like, wow, there's actually going to be a tie-in to another show.
That's so cool.
Yeah, Mutual Pal connected us, and I have that bio. I've got to start reading for a mid-August podcast. But this whole thing is a time warp since this episode's going up in October. We're recording in July. Actually, we're recording at ReaderCon, and you had to miss most of ReaderCon last year with a family issue. A, how was a year away from it? B, how's the festival or the con been this year?
Oh, it was wonderful to get back. Yeah, we had to leave last year. There was a death in the family, and had to leave basically the day.
Right before I got there, you could just say we saw Gil coming and we left.
Yeah, exactly. So right after we arrived, we had to leave. But so it was wonderful. It was like a reunion coming back here, and seeing a lot of old friends and meeting and making new ones and hearing a lot of readings. One of the great things now about ReaderCon in the last few years has become, there's a lot more younger people, and it's a much more diversity in the writers and readers and people who are here, which is really good to see. There were a few years there when I thought that the convention might just be kind of petering out, just because
aging towards
it was an
point.
Aging cohort, and which I'm part of it, and so and sometimes things like this do come to an end, and but they were able to I think change and adapt in terms of programming, and they started when a while ago they started offering free programming on Thursday to bring people from the community in, and I think just a lot more outreach and changing the nature of the panels and the discussions. And I'm just really, it's really wonderful to see a lot of young people and a lot of people I don't know, or a lot of people whose names I recognize, who are writers who are much younger than I am. And I'm like, oh, wow, I read your book and you're here. So that's a terrific thing about it. So it's a wonderful convention. I teach at an MFA program and also teach at numerous and various writers' workshops across the country. And I always tell the people I work with, the students and emerging writers, this is if you're in the Northeast, even if you're not, this is a great convention to come to, because it's not real, as not just limited to science fiction and fantasy and supernatural literature. There's just a huge amount of crossover in the writers and the readers who are here. So it's a really good opportunity. It's a small convention to come and meet and hear a lot of these people talk about their work and get in discussions with different writers. So it's a very exhilarating experience. It's also really tiring. This is Sunday morning.
Yeah, you can't get a little.
It's winding down. I'm like,
Yeah, how bad did you do the parties last night, or did you manage to?
No,
I figured,
no. This is the aging cohort part. I'm in bed like by 9:30 or 10.
Well, that's my thing. In past years, I do the same thing where I go out with a pal of mine from college, and usually when I get back, I'll stop by the patio downstairs and look for Michael Durda, Michael Swanwick, people like that, all the older cohort. I got back last night. My room happens to overlook that now. I can look down the patio. Didn't recognize a single person. Thought, you know what? just going to go to bed nice and early this time. Don't really need to sit around talking with, the old guys, and certainly the young people have no idea who I am, and I'll seem creepy and weird because I don't actually publish anything. So, although that falls into the Darger question, and even the notion of your original, putting aside Curious Toys, writing versus publishing, not versus. Writing,
I think it can be writing versus publishing, like Spy versus Spy.
Yeah, which won't happen anymore. We're losing Mad Magazine.
Yeah, right. We lost Mad Magazine.
But yeah, that notion of writing, I don't want to say for oneself, but without the notion of publishing necessarily. And certainly publishing meant a very different thing in 1915, or the 1920s when he was writing the book. But
meant a very different thing, in 2008 when we had Black Wednesday and the publishing industry collapsed. But I for myself and also for my students, I tell them that, you don't fixate on the publishing part, although, of course, we're always thinking about it. You really just have to immerse yourself in the process of writing, because at the end of the day, that's all you're going to have. You're not going to get rich. You're not going to get famous. I mean, maybe you will. It does happen, but it's like winning the lottery. So if you're not in love with the actual process of writing and learning about it and learning how to be better and reading widely and, exposing yourself to a lot of different writers and styles, writers from other backgrounds and cultures and countries, and either incorporating that into your own work or at least, taking a measure of it and learning from it. If you don't take a great amount of joy from that, you're basically going to be screwed, because the publishing aspect of it is, although it's wonderful, and I feel, as I was saying before, I feel incredibly fortunate to have been working with two amazing editors and with a team at this publisher that's extremely supportive of the book, publicists and marketing and everything else. And that's rare these days. But even given the best possible worlds for publication of a book, ultimately the writer, we have no control over what happens. People, there were books, wonderful novels that were released on 9/11. Oh yeah. And they disappeared because people, that they were overtaken by circumstances.
But the divine justice part of that was that also Jack Welch, the guy who used to run GE and fired tens of thousands of people, also released his big new CEO management book the same day. So, that was going to be
a silver lining.
Yeah. So at least he also, got his ass handed to him by a circumstance.
So that, that happened. And, the election in 2016, no matter, you may have different opinions of things than I do, but the fact is that it did impact publishing and book buying. And publishers are already looking ahead to next November, next fall about, book release with some of them with some trepidation for good reason. We were talking about Gibson before. You can't anticipate these things. So your book can have, the best blurbs, great reviews, great support, all of these things, and it comes out, on a day where something happens. Or your book comes out and unbeknownst to you until a few months before publication, somebody else has written a book on the same topic. It's like Colm Toibin and David Lodge both published wonderful books about Henry James at the same time. And one of them, they both, received good reviews, but one of them was more of a commercial success than the other. So we have no control over these things. And then ultimately, even if all these good things, the wonderful things happen and it's published on a beautiful day when nothing bad happens in the world, my agent, Martha Millard, who just retired last year, told me years ago, she said, you cannot force a reader to buy a book. And once they bought it, you can't force them to read it, and you can't force them to like it. You just have to accept that your control, the only thing you have control over is writing the book and revising the book and editing the book, and then, supporting it as much as you can, obviously. But once it's out in the world, you have no control over that. And that's a very difficult thing if you're somebody I'm not a control freak, but I'm very risk averse. Yeah. And writing and publishing are very risky undertakings.
You mentioned writing this on spec initially. do you, when I recorded with Christopher Brown on day one here, he talked about how his first book, Tropic of Kansas, he wrote on spec, but the sequel was part of a 2-book pitch, and that involved a very different process of outlining everything and providing all this. Do you find that, well, one, obviously knowing that the money is going to come in for one is more beneficial, but the process of writing one way versus the other?
Oh yeah, I hate writing on spec.
Yeah.
The only books I've written on spec were this one, which ultimately ended up not being on spec because I did sell it before I,
You finalized it, yeah.
But in Generation Loss, which was a terrible, which for a lot of reasons was a difficult writing experience. But one of the reasons was I was writing it on spec. And yeah, so that aspect of it I find very frightening. Not frightening, but it's just, it's risky. It's taking a risk.
It's a different blank page.
Yeah, and I'm now in the process of, writing a proposal outline for a new novel and working. Again, I've been very fortunate in that I have the input from these 2 editors from the outset who've been helping me craft a good outline, I hope. I mean, ultimately,
I guess that's the next question. How much in your experience do you tend to deviate from what that outline was?
Oh, a lot.
Okay.
And I have no idea. This one is very, very early stages, so I have no idea how, where it will go. But, in the past, deviate a lot from things. Because I'm the kind of writer, there's a line from the poet Theodore Rothke, I learn by knowing where I have to go. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of like that with writing. Sometimes I'll have an idea full blown in my head. I know the beginning, middle, end. I know everything. And it's all clear in my head, and it's just a matter of writing it down. That's a very rare experience. Usually, I have the character, I have the setting, I have the crime or, whatever engine of plot I'm using. And I will have an idea of how it ends, happy ending, not so happy ending, whatever. But the getting there, the journey, as I learn more about, the world, and sometimes as with Curious Toys, if it's an historical world I'm researching, I learn more facts and things. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that changes everything. And
Charlie Chaplin was around.
Yeah, things like that, or Ben Hecht, whatever. But, you find out things with Available Dark, which was the second Castaneri novel. It started with one plot, and then I'd been dimly aware of the black metal murders of the 1980s and early 1990s in Scandinavia, but hadn't researched them. And I started, through some fluke researching them. I was like, oh my God, this is my book. This is now what my book is about. And it was a successful book, but it was because of that, just the serendipity of finding that material and being able to incorporate it. So I'm working on a proposal for a new book, and I'm hoping that I'll have that serendipitous experience writing it. But it would be even better if I had that experience, like coming up with the outline. I could plug it all right in now.
Do you look back at outlines and think, wow, I really went off the rails from what we were...
Oh, yeah.
Do you look back at them periodically and just sort of laugh over...
completely different. Generation Loss was so different from the book it set out to be. It was just, a lot of them, they're just completely different. But I think that's like that. I think it's like that with a lot of writers. I mean, probably writers who are very experienced at producing a book a year in a series or a kind of book, who are very good at doing that. I would guess they might be better at just, sticking to the plot. That's their story and they're sticking to it. But I know a lot of writers who are seat of the pants writers and just kind of, they're making it up as they go along. I don't do that. I mean, early in my career, I did do that, which is not a good thing to do. So I definitely, work from a more solid outline now. But, at some point it goes off-piste. And
have you ever thought of a more regular series? I ask only because since we last spoke, I recorded with Richard Kadri out in San Francisco once, and he admitted he never thought he was a book-a-year guy for a 10-year run as he was with Sandman Slim. That was just not any part of his career. That was not what he was going to be. And all of a sudden, I got this idea, worked really well. Let me see how we can keep this. Has that ever been have you thought of really, pursuing that level of
Yeah, well, I kind of like to do that with the cast books, but I mean, when I wrote Generation Loss at that time, I had no idea I would turn it into a series. And I finished that book. I was like, I never want to think of that character away. That was real. That was burned out. I was like, I never want to be in that character's head. I feel like I got like this massive hangover from being in her head for however many years. But then I ended up writing 3 subsequent books, and I have 4 books. I have a 5th book that I would like to write, and I have kind of a vague outline in my head for what will happen. And I kind of feel like as long as people wanted to read those books, and as I was able to write them and not lose interest, I don't want the character to devolve into shtick. Yeah. If it could be like the Travis McGee series where the character is aging and changing and dealing with things, the changing world. Basically, if people would buy the books, if I could support myself by doing it, the economics factor in, then I would do it. If they don't, then, I'm not going to sit at home and just write them for my own pleasure to, show my friends.
15,000 pages of...
Yeah, right, 15,000 pages. I was like, no, I'm not going to, with the giant ball of twine in Maine. No, I'm probably not going to do that. But, I don't know, my editor floated the idea to my agent, not to me, about maybe I might want to come up with another series idea. And I thought, I don't have another series idea at this point. Maybe I could come up with one. I mean, you need a strong character to drive a series. And, it's coming up with a really strong character is a difficult thing to do. And I mean, I've done it. I've done it more than once throughout my career, and it's which I'm glad of. But, it's not something you can just sit down and kind of pull it out of a hat, or at least I can't.
Yeah. Yes, I'd wonder, because, again, sitting down with him, I remembered reading Richard's work, I think, in the old cyberpunk anthology.
Yeah, very different. Yeah.
And that was the,
Science Fiction Eye. Yeah, it is the same guy, yeah.
And Tom Tomorrow connected us, and when I started reading, I'm like, oh, you became this guy, but you're still, he's a writer's writer in a lot of neat ways. I just sort of wondered the series thing and the really regular series as opposed to a more intermittent, how tough it is to,
It's I write slowly is part of the issue. I'm a big reviser. I write very slowly and painstakingly, and and I do other things too. I do book. I'm a book reviewer and critic, so I do a lot of book reviews, and I teach in an MFA program in other places, and and sometimes I write. Other books come to me in between. I wrote Wilding Hall in between cast novels, and I wrote Radiant Days.
The guy with the Asia T-shirt, he was here again. We talked about him last time. We were talking about prog rock 2 years ago. Yeah, when we were coming out of wherever we were Friday night, I happened to notice the guy coming out of the elevator with the Asia T-shirt. I was going to mention it to you, but didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable, even though Asia was the first concert I ever attended. So I would have been able to sympathize with him and not sneer. Just felt he might take it badly.
No, I actually saw him. I was like, hey, I remember you.
Did you ever think of writing, we talk about series, working in comics?
I did work in comics.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worked in the early 1990s with my friend Paul Whitcover. We created and wrote a series for DC Comics called Anima, which featured the first openly bisexual and lesbian characters in comics, and dealt with the AIDS epidemic and gang violence and violence against young African American men in Chicago, and drugs. It dealt with all of these things like way ahead of its time, and it ran for 18 issues, and that was it. And they pulled the plug, and that's something that we've never gotten credit for. People who read it and are aware of it knew that what we did, but DC has never acknowledged that Anima, and maybe because she was a female character, maybe because she was a teenage girl and not a guy. I have no idea. They did not acknowledge that. So but yes, I did do the comic series then, and if somebody came knocking, I would be. I never say no to anything, and I loved doing it. It was a lot of fun working with Paul, and we worked with an amazing artist named Steve Crespo, who went on to, I think, the Cartoon Network. He went on to to good things, but when we've been in touch with him, intermittently over the years, we're always like, yeah, we should get the whole gang together. That was so much fun. He was a wonderful artist. So that was fun. So I did that. So I feel like, I did, I actually did do it.
Major foray into comics.
I made like a, major foray into, at DC. So it was like a big comics, company, but, so I would do it again, but, it's not something I feel like, there's a lot of younger writers, and there's a lot of younger, hungrier writers and people who are probably, really deserving of the opportunity to do that. And so I'm very happy that they're doing that. Having said that, if somebody came and said, hey, would you like to do this? I would definitely do it because it would be fun. But it's exciting to see, so much stuff coming out now that, you could not have fathomed really 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah, it's a very different world in a lot of respects.
And it's a different world in a lot of good ways. Yeah. Getting there has not always been easy or pleasurable. A lot of it has been difficult, but there've been, a lot of good things have happened in terms of, more diverse voices in publishing and in media and in comics. I mean, there's still a long way to go, but at least it's happening, and at least people are acknowledging that it needs to happen, and people are hammering down the walls even if they haven't fallen yet.
I could see people are outside waiting to touch the hem of your shirt, like they did a couple of years ago. And I went to a reading you were doing at night, and it was just flooded with people who were, it's Liz's hand.
Oh, that's very nice to think of. I'm very fortunate that I have readers who are very, loyal, which is a real gift for a writer, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, I guess it's something we hadn't really discussed before. That'll be the last question, I promise. You can get down to ReaderCon. The realization that you have an audience, A, when did that really hit you? And B, what is that dynamic like, I guess, in terms of writing, either knowing that, the audience is going to have to stick with me on this, or, is this something that's going to make them happy?
Well, I try, I try not to write thinking to please the audience, but I know that I have readers that, there's some of my readers, my core readers will read me no matter what I write. Mm-hmm. People who really like crime novels or psychological thrillers, there are a lot of those people who are fans of my work, but they only read the Cass books. They're not going to branch out and read the other books. And that's fine. I'm lucky that I have the different audiences. Same with some people who only, they'll only read stuff like Walding Hall, or Waking the Moon. But the first time I realized I actually had an audience was after Waking the Moon came out, which I think was 1994. And I was living in Maine at the time, but I was in D.C., where I had previously lived, to do a reading at a bookstore there. I think it was Olson's.
God, I remember that place.
Yeah. And one of my old haunts. And I got there, and there was like a line of people around the block to come in. and the manager of the store said, Deepak Chopra was here last week, and you have like twice as many people as he had. And I was like, are you kidding me? And I was stunned. But that was a point where that was kind of like a tipping point, because a lot of those people, people loved that book and still love that book. And it's not a book without flaws. I know that, especially looking at it now, 25, 26 years on. But a lot of those people followed me from book to book to book. And I know that because I see them on social media, or I see the conventions or readings or when a book comes out. So I think I was very fortunate with that particular novel to kind of strike a nerve with people who have continued to read my work. I mean, I feel very grateful that people read my work at all. And I don't care if it's like, 5 people or 500 people or, 500,000. That hasn't happened, but
there's pass around though. Maybe they're not all buying it, but they're certainly passing it.
Yeah. But so, it's people don't have to read. Well, a lot of people don't, but people don't have to read something. So for a writer, and I think many writers, I think all the writers I know feel this way. It's very humbling, and we're very grateful that people are reading our work. You don't have to do this. You're not, unless you're a book critic, you're not getting paid to do it.
And they barely get paid.
And I know, because that's what I do.
So you barely get paid.
You barely, you don't get paid. You're not getting paid a lot. So, the fact that people are reading your work, that's a real gift. And I do feel a certain responsibility to try to do my job as well as I can to be worthy of that, to merit people continuing to respond to my work. And people may not like it because they don't like this, particular genre or subgenre, and that, that's fine. But if I've done my job and written at least the best book that I could have under the circumstances, may not be the best book that anybody could write. There are many people who will have written better books, but if it was the best one that I could have written at any given time, I feel like that was, that's the best I can do, and ideally the best that I can offer to the people out there who will read that. But I'm very grateful to people who do that, and I love to hear from people on social media who, people who are discovering my work for the first time, people who've been reading it for decades. I love interacting with them, and I'm completely open too to get if somebody has like a, thoughtful criticism or suggestion, bring it on. Because
do you read Goodreads reviews of your stuff, or do you stay away from that?
I do. I have not in the past with this. With Curious Toys, I have, because my publisher had a giveaway of arcs of the books, advanced editions, and so, there's only a handful of reviews that have gone up so far, but so I have looked at those, and for the most part, they're very thoughtful. They're people who have read my earlier work, so they're writing very thoughtful reviews, and they'll mention things that actually, and they're very the ones that were the longer, more thoughtful ones were very positive, but they had, they were familiar with my my past work, so they were able to kind of see how this built on that. But because I am a reviewer, and if I'm writing a mixed review of a book, I am conscious of the author. It's not that I'm going to pull punches, but if I say something I want to that's critical or a place where I see where maybe they steered away from what they intended to do, I'll try to mention it in a way that will be useful to them as writers. Saying, I hated it, I hated the character, there's nothing I liked about this, but that's useful. That's useless. That's not useful to any writer. So I know from both sides what it's like. So I try to be mindful of that, and when I'm reviewing, I try to be mindful of what was the author's intent in this book. Not they didn't write the book I wanted to read, but did they write?
That tends to be my failing. I tend to read it as, I wouldn't have written this memoir in this way. I would have focused on X, Y, and Z, and I have to correct for myself and my own biases then. And usually when I revisit a book, it's I was just being an asshole because I had an idea where this should be going, and that's
that's something I've learned over 32 years of reviewing, to just try to intuit or understand the author's intentions and to honor those. Whatever she was trying to do, did she succeed? Why not?
I think you succeeded with this one.
Thank you.
Ecstatic about it. I'm glad Audrey Niffenegger turned me on to this one.
Well, thank you so much. She was wonderful. Yeah, she and I met last year for the first time. She was there. She was at Comic-Con in San Diego with Eddie Campbell. He was one of the guests of honor, and I was one of the guests of honor. And I was there with John, and the four of us had lunch, and I'm a huge admirer of Audrey's work, but we hadn't met, and we started talking, and maybe she asked we were asking what each other was working on, and I mentioned a book with Henry Darger. She was like, Henry Darger? and I was like, you know who Henry Darger is? She's like, yes.
Yes, animated Audrey is a particularly entertaining Audrey when she really gets thrilled about something.
So we bonded over that. It was wonderful. Cool.
Well, I'm always glad when pod guests collide. I'm always afraid they're going to talk about me, but generally I think that doesn't happen. So
that's great. So,
but thanks, Liz. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a lot of fun down at ReaderCon.
Well, you're so welcome, Gil. It's always a pleasure to see you and to talk with you. Thank you.
Thanks. And that was Liz Hand. Her new novel is Curious Toys from Mulholland Books, out this week. It's a fantastic read. I hope you pick it up. I hope you'll learn more about Henry Darger. I hope you just go along for the ride because Liz has constructed an amazing piece of work with this one. Now, you should also check out those Cass Neary novels we mentioned, starting with Generation Loss. Now, Liz's website is elizabethhand.com, which is spelled just the way it sounds, so I won't spell it out for you. But remember, there's going to be an H at the end of Elizabeth and an H at the start of hand, so whatever. It's got plenty of info about her books, reviews, classes, book tours, etc. Liz is also on Facebook, and she's on Twitter at Liz_Hand, so Liz_HAND. And after we wrapped, I asked Liz, so, who you been reading? Now, if you want to hear her answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get the third quarter 2019 episode up later this month, once my conference and board meeting and everything else are behind me. Meanwhile, the second quarter episode features an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Mark Allen Stamety, David Shields, Michael Carroll, Frederick Tutton, Ursi Soteropoulos, Caitlin Foisey, Seth, Nina Bunjevac, Stephen Guarnacha, Hugh Ryan, Bill Griffith, Boris Fishman, and Barbara Nessim. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog that I've started updating a bunch more often, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which I'm now starting to re-energize myself on, which I pray to God I will still have the energy for after I finish that conference and board meeting, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. I recorded this one during ReaderCon in Quincy, Massachusetts back in July. I got 2 other sessions in too. Those episodes aired in August and September with Christopher Brown and Kate Maruyama, respectively. The whole weekend probably cost maybe $500 for the hotel, meals, gas, coffee. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, and coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janazik, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, George Fow, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, David Small, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.